Let me tell you about a cool wet October in Chandler Falls, Texas, back in 1997, when a 24-year-old sawmill hand named Owen Halverson walked into a county tax auction with $2,340 in his pocket and walked out owning a small brick building on Sawmill Road that everybody in town had already agreed was full of nothing but rust. The town laughed at him for the better part of a month. By February, men were driving over from Nacogdoches and Shreveport in clean pickup trucks just to shake his hand. But before any of that happened, there was only a quiet young man, a dead grandfather, and a scrap of knowledge sleeping in the boy's hands that nobody in Chandler Falls thought was worth anything at all. Now, here's what you need to understand about Owen. He was tall and lean, with straight light hair the color of pine straw and pale gray eyes and skin already weathered from 3 years on the mill line. He was of Scandinavian appearance, plain and white, the way his people had always been in that part of the piney woods. He was polite, unhurried, and he did not talk much. Folks on the mill line liked him for that. He worked as a junior grader at the Pine Creek Sawmill for $8.40 an hour, and he lived alone in 2 rooms above the coin laundry on 4th Street. He kept his rent paid. He kept his boots resoled. He did not, most days, think very much about the past. Now, I want to back up here because everything that follows turns on what happened when Owen was a boy. From the age of 12 until he was 15, Owen spent every summer and most weekends in the small brick workshop out in Sawmill Road with his mother's father, an old Swede named Sigurd Halverson, who was the finest custom knife maker in 3 counties. Sigurd had come across the water from a village outside Malmo in 1948, and he had built his shop in Chandler Falls in 1953, and he had turned out handmade Bowie knives and folding hunters for private collectors all over the country for almost 40 years. He taught Owen the way old men teach when they know they only have a few good summers left. He taught him how to listen to steel. That's the phrase he used, listen to it. He taught him how to hear whether a piece of hot metal was ready by the sound the hammer made on the anvil, whether the ring was true or dull. He taught him how to read the color of the steel in the low light of the forge, cherry red for shaping, straw yellow for the tempering. That knowledge went into the boy the way water goes into dry ground. Then in the summer of 1988, when Owen was 15, his father left, and his mother packed their car and drove them up to Dallas so she could take a job at a dental clinic and get away from the memory of the marriage. Owen did not touch a hammer or a piece of steel or set foot inside his grandfather's workshop for the next 9 years. His mother, Marta, was Sigurd's only child, and she had fought with her father for most of her adult life. She died of breast cancer in a hospice bed in Dallas in February of 1996, and she made her peace with her father by telephone 3 weeks before the end. Owen held her hand while she died, and then he did what she had asked him to do in the last clear conversation they had. He packed one duffel bag and drove down to Chandler Falls in March of 1997 and started, slow as sunrise, trying to get to know his grandfather again. They had 4 months together. Owen would drive out to Sawmill Road on Sundays and sit in the workshop and drink coffee out of a chipped enamel cup while the old man worked. Sigurd was 82 by then, and his hands were slower, but they were still true. He didn't say much about Marta. He didn't need to. Some Sundays he would hand Owen a piece of steel and a file and say, plain, "Try that edge, boy, tell me what you feel." And Owen would try, and the old feeling would come up in his hands from wherever it had been sleeping, and Sigurd would nod once. And that was the whole conversation. Sigurd died in his sleep on a Wednesday night in the middle of July. He was 82. He left no will and 4 years of unpaid property taxes. The county in Chandler Falls has a rule about tax delinquent properties. After the second notice, they take the building. After the 4th year, they auction the contents. Sigurd's workshop, along with everything inside it, went on the auction docket for early October. The auctioneer was a soft-spoken man named Prosper Deloche out of Tyler, 61 years old, who had been calling country estate sales for close to 30 years. He walked through Sigurd's shop on a Thursday, and he saw what looked to him like the cluttered leftover mess of an old country tinker. Anvils, hammers, a soot-blackened forge, dark shelves crowded with dusty steel bars and bundles of oiled paper. He didn't recognize what he was looking at. Nobody who walked through that workshop in the 2 weeks before the auction recognized what they were looking at. Prosper set the opening bid at $400. Then on a Friday afternoon in the first week of October, Owen walked into the Farmer's Feed and Seed on Main Street to buy a can of chainsaw bar oil, and he saw the auction notice taped to the door on his way out. He read it once. He read it again. He stood there in the humid doorway for a long minute, breathing slow, and then he walked back to his truck and sat behind the wheel and did not turn the key for almost half an hour. And that's when everything changed. The custom knife trade in the American South during the mid-20th century was quietly one of the country's most specialized crafts. A single hand-forged bowie or folding hunter, made by a recognized maker, could take 40 to 60 hours of skilled work and required steel, heat control, and grinding knowledge that took a lifetime to master. By the 1990s, the introduction of factory-produced knives and the loss of the old apprentice tradition meant that entire shops could go to auction while the tools and materials inside them, worth tens of thousands of dollars to the right eye, were being priced as scrap. Part 2. The bid nobody understood. Now, here's where the story really starts to move. Owen went home that Friday night and sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee and did not sleep much. He was trying, in his slow, careful way, to decide whether the memory in his hands from those 3 summers when he was a boy could be trusted after 9 years of grading pine boards. Monday morning, he took a half-day off at the mill and drove out to Sawmill Road in his old blue Ford at 10 o'clock. Prosper DeLoach was there in a folding chair by the door with a clipboard. He nodded at Owen and told him to take his time. He moved through the workshop the way a man moves through a chapel. He touched the cool horn of the big anvil, ran his thumb along its edge, and stopped. He looked at the hammers hung on the pegboard, 5 of them, and he lifted one and set it down and lifted the next. He walked over to the long shelf against the north wall and picked up one of the dusty steel bars and held it up to the light and turned it slowly in his hand for almost 5 minutes. He looked at a stack of unfinished blade blanks on a corner of the bench. He opened a black leather notebook on a shelf above the vise, read 3 pages, and closed it. He looked at a small wooden box on the top shelf, opened the lid, and stood very still for a long moment. Then he closed the lid. He walked out into the wet October light and thanked Prosper and drove home. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote things down on a piece of yellow legal paper. He wrote that the anvil was a Peter Wright, hand-forged in Dudley, England, in the 1890s. One of the finest ever made. He wrote that 4 of the 5 hammers were Peddinghaus, German-made, from the 1930s, from an aerospace fabricator in Ohio that had closed after the war. He wrote that the 18 steel bars on the north wall shelf were Hitachi Yasugi steel, from Japan, white paper and blue paper grades, that his grandfather had bought by direct import in the middle 1970s, and that were now nearly impossible to obtain in that quantity anywhere in the country. He wrote that the 8 rough blanks on the bench were already half the work of a finished knife. He wrote that the black notebook held every heat-treating temperature, every grinding angle, every quench recipe, and the mailing addresses of 90 private collectors his grandfather had sold to across 3 decades. And he wrote that the small wooden box held a single finished folding hunter with a handle scaled in fossilized mammoth ivory, signed on the tang with Sigurd's initial and the year 1981. He wrote that the whole package, sold properly, was probably worth between $48,000 and $70,000. He had $1,600 in savings. He had his mother's plain gold wedding ring in a drawer, which he took to the pawn shop the next morning and sold for $500. And he did not let himself think about that while he was doing it. He asked his shift foreman, Deacon Robichaux, for a loan of $240 against his next 3 paychecks. And Deacon wrote the check without asking why. That gave him $2,340. The auction was Saturday. Now, here's what you need to understand about Denton Wade Voss. He was 55 years old, broad-chested, prosperous. He owned Voss Outfitters, the only real hunting and fishing store between Lufkin and the Louisiana line. He sat on the Chandler Falls City Council. He had over the previous 5 years made 2 offers to buy Sigurd Halverson's lot outright because he wanted to knock the workshop down and expand his own parking. Both offers had been insults, and both times Sigurd had refused with the kind of polite Scandinavian silence that landed harder than a cussing out. Voss had not forgotten either refusal. Voss showed up at the auction on Saturday morning in a pressed white western shirt and a Stetson so new it still had the sizing sticker on the sweatband, and he made a point of sitting front and center. Owen came in the back, wearing his working jeans and a clean flannel shirt, holding his cap in both hands. Prosper opened the bidding at $400. There was a long quiet, and then a farmer named Wilbur Landro raised his paddle at $425 out of pure neighborliness. Voss bid $500 without looking up. Somebody else bid $550. Voss bid $6. The bidding climbed slowly. By 1100 it was down to Voss and one out-of-town scrap dealer who dropped out at 1200. Voss smiled. He thought he had it. And then Owen raised his paddle from the back and bid 1300. Prosper hesitated on the podium. Voss turned around in his chair. When he saw who was bidding, his face went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. He turned back around and bid 14. Owen bid 15. Voss bid 16. The room had gone very quiet. Voss looked back over his shoulder and said, loud enough for the whole tent to hear, "Son, that's your granddaddy's rusty old shed. You sure you want to bury yourself in that hole?" Owen didn't answer. He just raised his paddle. 1700. Voss, red now under the collar, bid 19. Owen bid 21. Voss bid 22. Owen bid 22.15, which was the exact bottom of what he had in his pocket. Voss paused. He looked at his hands. The truth was he didn't actually want the shop. He wanted the lot. And he wanted to be the man who publicly took the last piece of Sigurd Halvorsson's estate away from Sigurd Halvorsson's grandson in front of the whole town. But 2215 was already past the point where his pride would let him pretend it was about the land. He shook his head. He waved his paddle down. He said, loud, "It's yours, boy. Enjoy the rust." The tent laughed. Prosper called the lot sold at $2,215. By that night, the word all over the diner on Main Street was the same word. The Halvorsson boy had lost his mind. Hand-forged tool steel, particularly the high-purity Japanese grades used in premium blade making, requires ore of specific chemistry and a slow, careful smelting process. By the 1990s, only a handful of small mills in Japan still produced Yasugi steel to the old standard, and it was almost never exported in bulk. A single 18-inch bar of blue paper grade in good condition could sell to a knife maker for well over $100. A workshop with 18 such bars was quite simply a small fortune sleeping in the dust. Part 3. The money comes in, and the trouble starts. Let me tell you what happened over the next 6 weeks, because this is the part where the town stopped laughing and started watching, and the watching is what changed everything. Owen spent the rest of that October moving nothing. He did not haul the anvil out. He did not touch the forge. He did not carry a single piece of steel home. He drove out to Sawmill Road every evening after his shift at the mill, unlocked the padlock, and sat inside the workshop with a Coleman lantern and read his grandfather's black notebook 1 page at a time. He told nobody, waiting until he was sure he would not do something stupid. On the second Sunday after the auction, an old man drove up the gravel drive in a rust-freckled Chevy pickup and got out slow. He was black, 70 years old, tall and thin with a short white beard. His name was Mercer Landry. He had spent 42 years as a metallurgist at the U.S. Steel Baytown plant, before retiring and moving up to Chandler Falls to be close to his sister. He had heard from a fellow at the Baptist church that a young white boy had bought Sigurd Halvorsson's shop and was telling people there was real steel inside. Mercer had known Sigurd since 1971, and he had come out that Sunday to see for himself. Owen was inside reading the notebook when he heard the truck. He came out. Mercer looked at him a long moment and asked, "Plain, you Marta's boy?" Owen said yes. Mercer nodded once and asked if he could see the shop. Owen said yes to that too. Mercer walked through the workshop the same slow chapel way Owen had walked through it. He stood in front of the shelf of Japanese steel bars for almost 10 minutes without touching them. He looked at the Peter Wright anvil, laid a flat palm on its face, closed his eyes. He picked up one of the Pettinghouse hammers, tested the balance, set it back on its peg. He turned to Owen and said, "Quiet. Your granddaddy showed me these bars when I first met him. He paid $3,200 for the whole shipment in 1974. In today's money, in the right hands, that steel alone is worth $30,000 or more." Owen said, "Quiet." Yes, he had guessed. Mercer said, "Boy, if you'll let me, I'd like to come out on Sunday evenings and help you take stock. I don't want any pay." Owen said thank you. That first Sunday, Owen wrote 3 letters from names in the black notebook: a collector in Prescott, Arizona, a collector in Bozeman, Montana, and a knife dealer in Charleston, South Carolina, all of whom had bought pieces from Sigurd in the 1970s. He mailed them that Monday. Within 12 days, all 3 had written back. The Charleston dealer sent a certified check for $800 against first refusal on the Mammoth Ivory Folding Hunter. The Bozeman collector drove 1,100 miles down in a Suburban and showed up at Owen's apartment on a Thursday night with a briefcase. And he paid Owen $1,400 cash for 2 of the Japanese steel bars and a set of Sigurd's old grinding jigs. By the end of the second week of November, Owen had taken in almost $4,000, and he had barely sold any of what was in the shop. And that's when the trouble started. In a town the size of Chandler Falls, $4,000 flowing quiet into a 24-year-old sawmill, hands does not stay quiet. And by the third week of November, Denton Wade Voss knew about every letter that had gone out and every check that had come in. He had spent the month telling anybody who would listen at the counter of his outfitters that the boy had somehow cheated the county out of a fair auction. On a Tuesday morning in the third week of November, Owen came home from the mill to find a certified letter waiting for him in his mailbox from the Chandler Falls Municipal Zoning Office. He opened it standing on the sidewalk in front of the laundry. It said, in the flat cold language of small-town city government, that the property at 1140 Sawmill Road was zoned light commercial, that the current use of the property constituted light manufacturing under Chandler Falls Municipal Code Section 14-8, and that this was in violation of the zoning classification. It said he had 30 days from the date of the letter to cease all manufacturing activity on the premises or face fines of $125 per day and possible seizure of the property. Owen read the letter twice. He looked up at the wet November sky over 4th Street. He walked upstairs to his kitchen and sat at the table for a long time. He knew who had walked into the zoning office. He didn't have to be told. That night, Mercer came out because Owen had called him from the payphone. Mercer read the letter and set it down on the workbench and looked at Owen a long time. He said, "Son, you can fight this thing in court, and we will lose. Voss sits on the council. 20 years of drinking coffee with the mayor. A young man alone in a shed does not beat a man like that in his own town." Owen sat down on the wooden stool by the forge. He looked at the black notebook lying open on the bench. He looked at his grandfather's Peter Wright anvil. The steel by itself was only steel. The hammers by themselves were only hammers. The knowledge in the notebook on its own was only ink on a page. A finished knife required all of it working together. The anvil, the fire, the hammer, the hand, and somebody standing in the doorway saying, "Yes, this is good. This is worth keeping." Owen had been trying to be a workshop with no town, and the shop was sitting there in the November dark trying to teach him the one thing his mother had left Chandler Falls to avoid, and his grandfather had lived his whole life without asking for. A man alone does not build anything that lasts. And that's when everything changed. In small American towns during the second half of the 20th century, zoning boards were one of the quietest and most effective tools by which local commercial interests could shut down independent competitors. A single complaint from the right person, filed at the right hour, could permanently close a workshop that had operated in the same location for 40 years. The remedy, when there was one, was almost never legal. It was social. It required the workshop's neighbors to be willing to speak. Part 4. The meeting at the old school. The Chandler Falls City Council met on the second Tuesday of every month in the old auditorium of the closed elementary school on Cypress Street. About 70 folks showed up that second Tuesday of November, 1997, which was maybe 3 times the normal crowd. Word had gotten around. Voss was there, front row center, arms folded, a small private smile on his face. The zoning matter was on the printed agenda under Old Business Item 4, and Voss had been telling folks all week that the young Halverson boy was running some kind of gray market operation out of that shed. Owen came in 10 minutes late, on purpose, with Mercer beside him. He carried a plain brown canvas bag. The room quieted when he walked in. He walked up to the front. He asked the council chair, an older gentleman named Wendell Prewitt, if he might have a few minutes to speak on Item 4 before the vote. Wendell glanced sideways at Voss and said yes. Owen set the canvas bag on the small folding table in front of the council dais. He took out 3 things. He took out the certified letter from the zoning office and laid it flat. He took out a single bar of the Japanese Yasugi steel, still wrapped in the original oiled brown paper with the black Japanese characters stamped on it, and he laid it beside the letter. And he took out the small wooden box from the top shelf of the workshop, and he set on the table the one finished folding hunter with the fossilized mammoth ivory handle, signed on the tang with his grandfather's initial and the year 1981. He looked out at the room. He did not look at Voss. He spoke plain, and slow. Most of you watched me bid $2,215 at the county auction back in October for what looked like my grandfather's shed full of rust. A good many of you told me to my face I'd lost my mind. I don't blame anybody for that. I didn't say much at the time because I wasn't sure yet what I had bought. Now I am. He paused. He picked up the bar of Japanese steel. What was in my grandfather's shop is some of the finest custom knife-making material and equipment in the state of Texas. I have 2 written appraisals here on this table, one from a dealer in Charleston and one from a collector in Arizona. I've been selling small pieces to qualified buyers, paying my sales tax on every transaction, and using the money to set up the shop so I can begin producing finished knives out of that workshop. I intend to teach the trade. It is the only future I can see for the piece of land my grandfather bought in 1953. He picked up the zoning letter. 3 weeks ago I received this. The city has given me 30 days to shut it all down. He set the letter down. He still did not look at Voss. I'm here tonight to ask my neighbors a favor I have never in my life once asked anybody. I am asking you to stand with me. I am asking you to write to the council. I am asking because I have finally understood at 24 years old that a man on his own doesn't build anything that lasts. The room was quiet for a long second. Then a big man in a plaid coat stood up in the 3rd row. His name was Ellis Broussard. He was the town's oldest butcher, 69 years old, run the meat counter at Hebert's Grocery for 44 years. Sigurd Halverson made me my first professional boning knife in 1964, Ellis said. Made me 3 more over the years. Never once did I pay him full price. He wouldn't let me. If the council wants to fight his grandson, the council fights me too. Then a woman stood up in the 5th row. Her name was Josette Fontaine. She ran the kitchen at the elementary school where they were sitting. Sigurd sharpened every knife in my school kitchen for 20 years for a plate of hot dinner once a month. I will write to this council tonight. Then a game warden stood up. Then a retired fire chief. Then Mercer, quiet, said, I worked steel 42 years. What's in that shop is real. This boy is real. I will speak at any hearing the council wants. And then, to the silent astonishment of every person in that auditorium, Prosper D. Loach himself stood up from the 9th row. He cleared his throat. I priced that workshop at $400 because I did not know what I was looking at. This boy did. That is not a crime. That is exactly how this country is supposed to work. Voss in the front row did not stand. He did not speak. He looked at the floor. The room had turned away from him without ever once needing to turn toward him. Within 9 days, the zoning complaint was quietly withdrawn. 6 months later, on a mild, bright morning in April, 1998, Owen stood in the doorway of his grandfather's workshop with 3 young students behind him. 2 were local boys from the Mill families. One was a woman of 30 from Lufkin who had driven up every Saturday for 8 weeks asking Owen to teach her. The forge was lit. The Peter Wright anvil was warm. A finished folding hunter, the second Owen had ever completed on his own, lay bright on the workbench. Owen reached up onto the pegboard and took down the oldest of the 5 Pettinghouse hammers, the one with the darkest oak handle, the one his grandfather had used the most. He handed it, handle first, to the oldest of the 2 boys, a shy young man with pale hair and rough hands who had shown up quiet at the shop every Sunday since January. The boy took the hammer slow. Owen watched him. Then he said the only thing he ever said out loud about the whole story. Anything worth keeping. Somebody had to stay long enough to teach. The boy nodded. He turned the hammer once in his own hand. Outside the workshop door, the East Texas sun came up over the pines, and the light came in through the small window and fell across the anvil and the shelf of Japanese steel. The American custom knife tradition, at the close of the 20th century, survived in only a handful of small workshops scattered across the South and the West. What kept those shops alive was almost never the value of the tools themselves, which was often considerable. What kept them alive was the willingness of one older maker to teach a younger one, and the willingness of the younger one to stay in the shop long enough to learn. When either link broke, the shop closed, and the knowledge went with it into the ground.